Simon and Jackie had a love story that many envied and admired. They were inseparable, bound not just by affection, but by a deep understanding and mutual respect. Jackie was a radiant woman with a kind heart, while Simon was a thoughtful, loving husband who would do anything to see his wife smile. Their laughter often filled their modest apartment, making it feel warm and full of life. The only shadow that loomed over their otherwise perfect marriage was their struggle to have children. Year after year, they tried without success. Each negative pregnancy test chipped away at their spirits. Still, their love never wavered. Simon, Jackie would often say, holding his hand, "I know it's hard, but we have each other. That's enough for me." Simon would kiss her forehead and reply, "And I'll always believe our miracle is coming." Always. Their faith and perseverance led them to countless doctors, specialists, and even spiritual retreats. They prayed together, fasted, and tried every medical treatment recommended. Then, one sunny afternoon, Jackie surprised Simon with the news that changed their lives forever. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, holding out the positive test with trembling hands. Simon's eyes widened. "What? Jackie, are you serious?" Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. "We're having twins, Simon." Overwhelmed with emotion, Simon lifted her off the ground, spinning her around the living room as they laughed and cried together. "God, thank you," Simon exclaimed. "Our miracle is finally here." The months that followed were filled with joy and preparation. They painted the nursery a soft yellow and filled it with tiny clothes, toys, and cribs. Jackie blossomed with her pregnancy, her smile even more radiant as she felt their babies kick and grow inside her. One evening, when Jackie was 8 months pregnant, they decided to have a quiet night at home. The aroma of freshly made popcorn lingered in the air as they snuggled on the couch, watching an old romantic movie. "Can you believe this is going to be us soon?" Jackie said, her voice dreamy. "Watching movies with 2 little ones asleep in our arms." Simon chuckled. "I'm ready for the chaos. Bring it on." They shared a tender kiss, savoring the peace and love that enveloped them. But that peace was brutally shattered. A sudden, violent crash came from the front door. Simon sprang to his feet, heart racing. "Stay here," he whispered to Jackie, who clutched her swollen belly in fear. Before he could take a step, 3 masked men burst into the living room, armed and menacing. "Don't move," one of them barked, pointing a gun at Simon. "What do you want?" Simon demanded, his voice shaking. "Take whatever you want, just don't hurt us." The leader sneered. "We'll take what we came for." Without warning, one of the men struck Simon across the face with the butt of his gun. He fell to the floor, dazed and bleeding. Jackie screamed, but the men silenced her with brutal force. Simon struggled to stay conscious, his vision blurring as he saw them drag Jackie away. "No, Jackie," he slurred, but darkness claimed him. When Simon woke up, the living room was eerily silent. His head throbbed and blood crusted his face. Panic gripped him as he struggled to his feet. "Jackie," he shouted, stumbling through the house. His heart stopped when he found her in the bedroom. Jackie lay motionless on the blood-soaked floor, her once glowing face pale and lifeless. Her dress was torn, and the evidence of the unspeakable violence she had endured was clear. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of blood. "No, no, no, no." Simon collapsed beside her, cradling her in his arms. "Jackie, please, wake up. Please, God, don't take her from me." Trembling, he fumbled for his phone and dialed the emergency number. His voice was hoarse as he pleaded, "I need an ambulance. My wife, she's hurt. She's not breathing. Please hurry." The operator's voice was calm but urgent. "Stay on the line, sir. Help is on the way." Simon clung to Jackie, rocking back and forth as he whispered desperate prayers. "I promised I'd protect you," he choked out. "I failed you, Jackie. I failed our babies." The ambulance arrived minutes later, but time had already sealed its verdict. The paramedics worked frantically, but Simon knew. The hollow expression on their faces confirmed his worst nightmare. "I'm sorry," one of them said gently. "She's gone. The babies too." Simon's world shattered. The weight of the loss crushed him, leaving a void that no words could fill. "I should have died with them," he whispered, his voice broken. The paramedic placed a hand on his shoulder. "You survived for a reason. Don't lose hope." But hope felt like a foreign concept to Simon as he watched the love of his life and their unborn children carried away. He stood there, numb as the world around him moved on, oblivious to the devastation in his heart. Life had dealt him a blow that seemed impossible to recover from. Simon's heart ached with every step as he made the painful preparations to bury Jackie. The day of the funeral arrived, and the weight of it pressed down on him like an unbearable burden. Surrounded by mourners, Simon's mind was elsewhere. He had no tears left. His grief had transformed into something darker. The thought of the brutal attack on his beloved Jackie and their unborn children consumed him, seething with an unrelenting rage. As they lowered her casket into the ground, Simon stood there, trembling with fury and sorrow. He whispered a vow, one that would fuel every moment of his existence from that day on. "I will find you," he muttered through clenched teeth. "Whoever did this to you, whoever took you from me, I swear I will make them pay." The burial ceremony ended and the mourners dispersed, but Simon's resolve remained unshaken. He stayed at the cemetery long after the others left, staring at the fresh grave that marked the end of his once perfect world. Days passed, but Simon couldn't rest. He became consumed by one thing: finding his wife's killers. Every waking moment was spent obsessing over the attack. He couldn't shake the image of Jackie's lifeless body and the faces of the men who had taken everything from him. He needed justice, no matter the cost. Simon began poring over every detail of the night. He revisited the CCTV footage from their apartment, desperate to find any clue, anything that might lead him to the perpetrators. The footage was difficult to watch, but he forced himself to relive the horrific scene. His mind screamed in fury as he saw the armed men beat him unconscious and violate his pregnant wife. But then, a flicker of hope. In the midst of Jackie's screams, she managed to rip the mask from one of the attackers. His heart raced as he watched the face of the man exposed in the footage. Simon zoomed in on the image, his breath hitching in his chest. There was no mistaking it. He recognized the face. It was a man he had seen before, though he couldn't quite place where. The realization hit him like a freight train. It was the son of the Inspector General of Police. Simon had seen him at social events, in the presence of his father, always carrying himself like someone above the law. With this crucial evidence in hand, Simon immediately took the case to the police, desperate for justice. But what he didn't expect was the cold, calculating response from the authorities. When Simon presented the footage to the officers, their reaction was not one of concern or determination. Instead, they seemed uncomfortable. The room became tense as they exchanged knowing glances. The officer in charge cleared his throat. "Mr. Simon, we understand your anger, but you've made a very serious accusation," he said, his voice calm but lacking sincerity. Simon's heart raced. "You see the man's face. He's the one who did this to my wife. He's the one who took everything from me. You have to arrest him." The officer's gaze dropped to the floor. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Simon. The man in that video is indeed the son of the Inspector General of Police. His name is Kelvin, but..." Simon's blood ran cold as he realized where this conversation was headed. "But what?" he demanded. The officer hesitated, clearly trying to choose his words carefully. "You see, Mr. Simon, Kelvin is untouchable. His father is the most powerful man in the force. If you press this issue, if you pursue this any further, we cannot guarantee your safety. We cannot guarantee that you'll ever see justice." Simon's hands clenched into fists. "So you're telling me to just forget about what happened to my wife and children? To let them get away with murder?" The officer's voice dropped, now laced with a threatening undertone. "I'm not telling you anything, Mr. Simon. I'm advising you. Leave this alone, or there will be consequences." Simon's mind raced. His anger swelled within him, but he forced himself to stay calm, to think. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I will not be intimidated. I will not stop until they pay for what they've done." But deep down, Simon knew the police were not on his side. His heart sank as he realized that his pursuit of justice had placed him in direct opposition to one of the most powerful families in the country. That night, Simon was unable to sleep. He felt like a cornered animal, desperate and exposed. Hours later, he received a chilling phone call. "Mr. Simon, this is your final warning. If you don't drop this case, we'll make sure you regret it," the voice on the other end of the line said, cold and devoid of any empathy. "You won't be able to hide anywhere. You will be silenced." Fear gripped Simon, but so did something else, a fierce determination. He knew he could no longer trust the system he had once believed in. The authorities, the very people who were supposed to protect him, had become his enemies. He had no choice but to take matters into his own hands. He packed a bag in the dead of night, knowing that staying in the country would only bring more danger to his life. He left a letter behind for his family, explaining why he had to disappear, why he could no longer fight within the confines of a corrupted system. Simon crossed the border into Ghana, determined to escape the clutches of the police and the deadly reach of the Inspector General's son. But even in a foreign land, the weight of his vow remained heavy on his chest. "I will find you," Simon swore under his breath as he boarded a flight to Accra. "You can run, but I'll never stop hunting you down. No matter how far you go, I'll make you pay for what you did to Jackie and my babies." Simon had spent weeks in Ghana keeping a low profile. He rented a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood and tried to maintain a routine that wouldn't draw attention. Every day was a battle between grief and rage. His nights were haunted by the memory of Jackie and their unborn twins, while his days were filled with plotting how he would bring Kelvin to justice. But Simon knew he needed a strategy. Ghana was foreign territory, and his resources were limited. He couldn't afford any mistakes. Patience, he reminded himself. Revenge is best served cold. One afternoon, Simon decided to step out for groceries. The sun was high, and the streets buzzed with life. He walked through the aisles of the mall, placing essentials into his basket. The mundane act momentarily dulled the sharp edges of his pain. As he moved toward the checkout counter, he saw a man approaching from the opposite direction. Time seemed to slow as Simon's eyes locked onto the familiar face. His heart skipped a beat, and then fury surged through his veins. It was Kelvin. The man walked confidently, dressed in casual but expensive clothes. His arm was around a beautiful woman who carried herself with grace. A little boy, no older than 5, clung to Kelvin's other hand, laughing as they moved together like a picture-perfect family. Simon's vision blurred with rage. The man who had destroyed his life was here, in the same mall, living a carefree and happy existence. Kelvin's laughter echoed in Simon's ears, a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. Simon gripped the handle of his basket so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded, and his breath became shallow. The desire to act on impulse consumed him. "Find a weapon," a dark voice whispered in his mind. "End him right here, right now." Simon's eyes darted around the mall. There were sharp objects on the shelves, heavy items that could do the job. His muscles tensed as he calculated the fastest way to strike. But then another thought pierced through his rage. Death? That would be too easy, too merciful. Kelvin wouldn't suffer if he died quickly. Simon wanted him to feel the pain, the helplessness, and the torment that Jackie had felt. He wanted Kelvin to lose everything, his comfort, his reputation, his family. And only then would Simon consider ending him. Simon took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. He couldn't afford to act impulsively. Not here, not now. He needed a plan, one that would ensure Kelvin paid in the most excruciating way possible. Kelvin and his family passed by without noticing Simon. The rage simmered beneath Simon's skin, but he kept his expression neutral. His mind raced as he silently followed them at a safe distance, observing every detail: the car they got into, the license plate number, and the direction they drove off. Simon's heart was pounding in his chest as he followed Kelvin's car from a distance, his hands gripped tightly on the wheel. The wheels of his mind turned faster than the car itself, his thoughts spinning with dark possibilities. He had almost considered ramming the car from behind, sending it spiraling into an accident. It would be quick, no more pain, no more suffering. But then the thought of innocent lives being lost, of a woman and child, stopped him cold. He wasn't a monster. No matter how much rage burned inside him, he couldn't imagine hurting an innocent family. The images of Jackie and their unborn children torn away from him were still too fresh. But Simon knew he had to take control of his emotions. He couldn't make a rash decision. Not yet. He needed answers. So he followed. The car wound through the city streets, eventually driving into an upscale neighborhood. Simon's eyes narrowed as he watched them turn into a large, beautifully manicured estate. The mansion loomed behind a wrought iron gate, its towering structure more like a fortress than a home. Simon parked at a distance, out of sight, but close enough to see the house clearly. He took a deep breath and checked the time. He had been following them for hours, but his mind wouldn't allow him to rest. There was no way Kelvin, who was supposedly involved in an attack on him and his family, would live in a place like this. Why would someone who had destroyed Simon's life live so comfortably in a place so untouched by the consequences of his actions? He stayed in his car, eyes glued to the mansion as the night stretched on. His thoughts were a whirlwind. But one thing remained certain. He needed answers. He couldn't let this go. The questions kept piling up. Why did Kelvin come after him specifically? Was there more to the attack than just a robbery gone wrong? Why would someone so seemingly rich and powerful feel the need to hurt someone like Simon, a man who had no wealth, no power? Simon was still processing these thoughts when the early morning hours arrived. The stillness of the night was shattered by the sound of the gate opening. His eyes snapped to attention as Kelvin's car slowly began to pull out of the driveway, this time without his wife and child. Simon's heart skipped a beat. This was the opening he had been waiting for. Alone with no one to shield him, Kelvin was vulnerable. This was it. This was the moment. Simon's hands clenched around the steering wheel, his mind fully consumed by the singular focus of his mission. The anger that had built up for months was boiling over, but Simon had a clearer sense of purpose now. He wasn't just acting on rage, he was in control. He waited for the perfect moment, the right stretch of road where the darkness would hide his actions. And then, with one swift motion, Simon slammed his car into Kelvin's. The impact was brutal. Kelvin's car spun off the road, tires screeching as it veered off course and slammed into a tree with a sickening crunch. Simon's pulse thundered in his ears as he slammed the brakes and jumped out of his car. His gaze immediately went to the wreckage of Kelvin's vehicle. The front end was crumpled, smoke rising from the engine. Inside, Kelvin was motionless, his head having hit the steering wheel with force. The air was thick with the scent of burning rubber and the sharp tang of metal. Simon approached the car cautiously, keeping his mind focused. He was no longer a man bent on blind vengeance. He was methodical, calculated. He opened the passenger side door and dragged Kelvin out with a surprising amount of strength. Kelvin's body hung limp as Simon hoisted him over his shoulder, ignoring the pain that shot through his muscles. The man who had caused Simon's entire world to shatter, the one who had taken everything from him, was now at his mercy. Simon tossed Kelvin's unconscious body into the back seat of his own car and sped off, taking the back streets to avoid being seen. His thoughts were a whirlwind, but his resolve remained firm. He was bringing Kelvin to a place where he could finally get the answers he had been seeking. Once they reached Simon's house, a small, quiet place tucked away from prying eyes, he hauled Kelvin inside and dragged him to the basement. Simon had prepared for this moment, making sure no one would be around to stop him. He tied Kelvin up with rope, securing him tightly to a metal chair in the dimly lit basement. Simon stepped back, admiring his work. Kelvin was still unconscious, his head resting against the chair, his breath shallow but steady. Simon splashed a bucket of cold water across Kelvin's face, instantly jolting him awake. His eyes shot open in panic, and he gasped for air, his body writhing as he tried to process the shock of the cold liquid. He shook his head, still disoriented, and tried to push himself up, but the ropes that bound him to the chair held him firm. His eyes met Simon's, and that's when he saw it. The rage that simmered beneath Simon's calm exterior. The man wasn't just angry, he was seething with a deep, unrelenting fury. Simon stepped forward, his hand shaking slightly as he held up his phone, showing the footage that had been burned into his mind for the past several days. The grainy video displayed the brutal scene. His wife, Jackie, helpless, her face terror-stricken as she clawed at her attackers. And then, there it was, the moment she managed to pull off the mask of one of her assailants. Kelvin's face. The truth in all its horrifying clarity was now inescapable. Kelvin's face drained of all color as he realized the game was over. Simon didn't need to say a word. The evidence was undeniable. He was caught. Simon's eyes darkened with a cold fury that made Kelvin's breath catch in his throat. He felt trapped, like a cornered animal with no way out. Simon's voice was a low growl. "Do you know who I am? The man whose life you ruined? The man who has nothing left but revenge for the woman and children you killed?" Kelvin, his mind racing, suddenly sought to regain some semblance of control. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. He tried to shift in the chair, but the ropes dug into his skin. Simon didn't respond immediately. His anger was palpable, and the air around them seemed to thicken. He didn't need Kelvin's words. He knew who he was dealing with. But what Simon did next took Kelvin by surprise. Without warning, Simon grabbed a knife from a table nearby and drove it into Kelvin's palm. The sharp steel pierced his skin with ease, and Kelvin screamed in pain and gritted his teeth as blood oozed from the wound. "You're the son of a police officer who has no clue where his son is right now," Simon said, his voice trembling with fury. "And if you don't answer my questions, you will beg for death. But I won't give you the mercy of a quick end." Kelvin's eyes widened in horror as he saw his blood drip steadily to the floor. The pain was excruciating, and Simon's eyes remained locked on Kelvin, filled with a chilling resolve. "Please, please," Kelvin whimpered, his voice barely audible as he looked at Simon, now trembling in fear. Simon leaned in closer, his voice now a deadly whisper. "Tell me why. Why did you do this? Why my wife? Why my children? What made you think you had the right to destroy everything I ever loved?" Kelvin, now visibly shaking, stared at Simon with a mixture of fear and regret. He knew that there was no escape now, no more lies to cover up his actions. I knew her before you did," Kelvin began, his voice weak. "Jackie, we were together once, before you came into the picture." He paused as if trying to gather his thoughts, but his fear of Simon's wrath kept him from taking his time. "We broke up, but I never got over her. And when I heard that she was married, I wanted her back. I couldn't let go. You were just an obstacle, a man who stood in the way of what I thought was mine. But she didn't want me anymore, Simon. She chose you, and I couldn't stand it." Simon's hands trembled with fury as he absorbed Kelvin's words. "So you killed her because she chose me and not you?" Simon asked in fury. Simon clenched his fists, the rage inside him threatening to consume him. He was barely able to contain the tremor of fury in his voice. "You thought you could just take her. That's what this was all about. You're a monster. You ruined her. You killed my babies. And for what? Because you couldn't let go." Kelvin's eyes filled with tears, but his fear of Simon far outweighed any remorse he might have felt. I didn't mean to. It wasn't supposed to go that far. Please, Simon, I'm sorry. I never wanted this to happen. It wasn't supposed to be like this." Simon's lips curled into a sneer. "Sorry doesn't bring her back. Sorry doesn't give me back what you took from me. You'll never know what it's like to lose everything. And you'll never know peace again, Kelvin." The silence in the basement was deafening, and Simon's mind raced as he stared at Kelvin, whose bound form was slumped against the chair. His hands trembled, but it wasn't just fear or anger. It was the weight of the decisions that were about to unfold. What could Simon do to make Kelvin feel even a fraction of the agony he had experienced? What could possibly match the horror that had been inflicted upon his wife and children? Simon couldn't answer those questions, but deep down, he knew what he had to do. He had to make Kelvin understand the full weight of his actions. But just as the plan began to form, exhaustion overtook him. He had been awake for days, consumed by his need for vengeance, and now, in the dim light of the basement, sleep pulled him under like a suffocating wave. The dreams came quickly. Jackie's face appeared before him, so vivid, so real. She was standing there, her warm smile just as he remembered it. But this time, her eyes were filled with sorrow. Her voice, soft and almost ethereal, whispered through the darkness. "Simon, justice. You have to bring them to justice. Do it for us." Simon's heart ached as he reached for her, but she faded away, leaving him with a haunting emptiness. His chest tightened, and the pain of losing her and their children consumed him. He awoke suddenly, gasping for air. The basement's cold air hit his face, and for a moment he didn't know where he was. But then everything flooded back. His mind was clearer now, driven by the dream, by Jackie's plea. Justice. In the days that followed, Simon put his mind to work. He reached out to his few trusted contacts, digging through every bit of information he could find. He wasn't going to stop until he had all of them, every last one of the men who had participated in his family's destruction. The shock came when he discovered the truth. 2 of the men who had been involved were police officers. Men who had sworn to protect, but instead had worked for the very man who had destroyed Simon's life. The web of corruption and deceit ran deeper than he had imagined, and the realization fueled his resolve even further. Simon's next move was swift and calculated. He discovered that the entire crew, including Kelvin, had gone into hiding in Ghana, knowing the police were likely too corrupt to come after them. But Simon wasn't deterred by their hideout. In fact, he found it to be a blessing. One by one, he tracked down the men responsible. He moved quickly, efficiently, no time for mistakes. His first target was the man who had led the attack with Kelvin, the one who had struck the first blow against him and Jackie. With the precision of a predator, Simon found him, cornered him in a small apartment, and dragged him back to his basement. The man begged for his life, but Simon remained unmoved, tying him to a chair beside Kelvin. The next target was another officer, one who had participated in the assault, his uniform stained with Simon's pain. This man was equally as arrogant as the others, but Simon's fury had no room for mercy. He hunted him down in the middle of the night and without hesitation brought him back to the basement as well. Now Simon had them all. Each one of them was now bound, trapped in the same hell they had created for Simon and his family. As Simon looked at the men before him, bound and broken, the anger inside him became a fire that consumed everything else. He no longer saw the men as human, no longer as individuals who could beg for mercy. They were nothing more than the embodiment of the pain they had caused him, and he was determined to make them feel even a fraction of that agony. His hands clenched into fists, and the only thing that mattered now was the justice he intended to exact. The pain they had inflicted on his wife and unborn children would not go unpunished. Simon stood tall, his cold eyes scanning the men who had destroyed everything he had loved. He had made them suffer through days of hunger, days of darkness. But now it was time to make them feel the pain that they had inflicted on Jackie, on their children. He pulled out a high-tension wire, its sharp metallic gleam reflecting the dim light of the basement. One by one, he fastened the wires to the men's bodies, the jolt of electricity quick and brutal. It wasn't enough to kill them, not yet, but it was enough to make them scream. The current was just strong enough to send searing pain through their bodies, to make them beg for death. But Simon wasn't moved by their pleas. Their suffering meant nothing to him. Every cry, every desperate word that left their mouths only deepened his resolve. He watched as they writhed in pain, as their bodies convulsed from the shocks, and the corners of his mouth twitched, but not in pity. No, it was something darker. It was satisfaction. The 2 weeks that followed were nothing short of hell. Simon didn't allow them to sleep, didn't allow them any comfort. He kept them in a constant state of suffering, feeding them only the bare minimum to keep them alive. He tortured them with relentless precision, pushing them to their breaking point and then beyond. The terror in their eyes was all the validation Simon needed. It was the reflection of the fear his wife must have felt, of the helplessness she endured in her final moments. And still, Simon remained unmoved. His mind was sharp, his resolve unshakable. Every scream they made, every tear that stained their faces, only served to fuel the fire within him. The weight of his loss had hardened his heart, and in that basement he was no longer the man he used to be. When he felt they had suffered enough, when he could no longer hear their sobs and begging without feeling the cold detachment of a man who had lost everything, Simon knew it was time to take the next step. It was time for Kelvin father to see what his actions had caused. It was time for him to feel the full weight of his son's sins. Simon pulled out his phone, the screen flickering in the low light. He recorded the men one last time, their broken bodies, their pitiful, defeated expressions. He captured every desperate word, every ounce of pain they had endured. When the footage was complete, Simon sent it directly to Kelvin's father, the man who had turned a blind eye to his son's atrocities, the man who had enabled the monster his son had become. The footage was a message, a declaration of what had been done in the name of vengeance. Simon wasn't just punishing them, he was sending a clear warning to Kelvin's father. The consequences of his son's actions would not go unnoticed. He would pay, just as they had. As Simon sent the video, he felt no sense of satisfaction, no relief. The hole in his heart, the emptiness left by Jackie and their children, could never be filled by vengeance alone. But at least this act, was something. It was justice in its most twisted and cruel form. Kelvin's father's blood boiled as he watched the footage of his son writhing in pain, the screams echoing through the video as a reminder of how his world had just been turned upside down. He slammed his fist on the desk, the fury in his eyes burning with rage. The unthinkable had happened. Someone had dared to humiliate his son, to make him suffer like this. Simon had taken everything from him in one swift move, and he wouldn't let it stand. "Find him," Kelvin's father growled to his loyal officers. "Find this rat and bring him to me. I will make sure he suffers more than my son ever will." They traced the signal from the video, pinpointing the location in Ghana where Simon had sent the message. A small, quiet house on the outskirts of the city. With no time to waste, Kelvin's father, along with some of his most trusted officers, prepared for a secret, unofficial rescue mission. He didn't trust the official channels. This had to be done under the radar. Armed to the teeth, they moved under the cover of darkness, their blood boiling, driven by the need to protect his son and wipe out the man who had dared to bring him down. Simon was no fool, though. He had been expecting this. He had anticipated Kelvin's father's next move and had already moved the men to another location, knowing that every step of the plan had been calculated. While Kelvin's father and his team drove to the house, Simon kept a close eye on them from a hidden vantage point. He wasn't just playing the role of a victim anymore. He was the hunter, and Kelvin's father was the prey. Simon made a single phone call, the phone ringing until it was picked up on the other end. Kelvin's father's voice came through, sharp and full of malice. "How dare you?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "What do you want from me? You think you can break me? You are nothing. Nothing but a rat. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Simon's voice was cold, calculated, and full of authority. "You've taken everything from me, and now it's time for you to face the consequences. Confess your sins. Admit what you and your son did to my family, how you used your power to destroy innocent lives. Admit your role, and I'll make sure this ends here. If you keep hiding behind your money and your influence, I'll make you regret it." There was a long, mocking laugh on the other end of the line. "Confess. Do you know who I am, boy? I am untouchable. My son is untouchable. Do you really think a rat like you can make me bow? I control everything, everyone. Even the president is in my pocket. You're just a nuisance I'll squash the moment I catch you." The arrogance in his voice made Simon's blood boil, but he kept his calm, his tone steely as ever. "You're a coward, hiding behind power and money, but no amount of influence can save you now. You'll answer for what you did, and I'll make sure of it." Kelvin's father's laugh deepened, filled with mockery. "You think you scare me? I'll find you, and when I do, you'll wish you never crossed me. You'll beg for mercy, just like you silly wife did before my son enjoyed her and tossed her to the trash. But there will be none. You've made a grave mistake, Simon. You've come up against someone you can't defeat. And when you're finally caught, you'll learn that money and power can silence anyone, even you." Simon clenched his fist, his body tensing with fury. He knew the man's words were empty threats, a desperate attempt to regain control over a situation he had already lost. But he wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not when he was so close. "I've already won, old man," Simon replied, his voice unwavering. "You may think you're invincible, but I'll be the one to bring you down. I'll make sure everyone knows what you and your son did. No one will be able to protect you." Kelvin's father's voice turned into a growl of frustration. "Who would believe a nobody like you over an inspector general of the police of the greatest nation in Africa? You're a dead man walking, Simon. The moment I get my hands on you, I'll make sure you're the one begging for mercy." The words were still hanging in the air when the world around Kelvin's father turned into chaos. The first sound he heard was a loud, sharp burst of static, followed by a voice booming through loudspeakers.
"This is the Ghanaian police. Put down your weapons and step out of the house slowly. We have your confession on record. We repeat, put down your weapons and come out slowly."
Kelvin's father froze. His eyes went wide with disbelief as the voice continued, and then he heard the unmistakable sound of helicopter blades whirring overhead. The spotlight from the chopper cut through the darkness, illuminating the house with blinding intensity. His heart began to race, his mind scrambling to process what was happening. But the words that followed made his stomach drop even further. "I told you I would be the one to bring you down, old man." Simon's voice rang through the phone, its coldness sending a shiver down Kelvin's father's spine. A deep sense of dread settled over him, and his hand trembled as he lowered the phone. He hadn't heard the approach of the police, hadn't seen it coming at all. The revelation was as much of a shock as the realization that he had been cornered. He couldn't remember the last time he had been so out of control. Simon's voice came again, icy and controlled, as if he were the one calling the shots. "There are cameras all over the house you're in," Simon continued, "and your confession has been duly recorded. All of it. The lies, the threats, the arrogance. It's all there. The world will know what you've done." And just like that, checkmate. Kelvin's father staggered back a step, as if the very ground beneath him had shifted. He turned sharply to the officers beside him, his mind now racing through the implications of the situation. His anger, so full of power moments ago, was replaced by something far more terrifying. Fear. Real, deep, unshakable fear. No, this can't be happening," he muttered under his breath, trying to rally the confidence he'd spent decades building. His voice wavered slightly. "This is a trap. There's no way you could have done this. This is impossible." But Simon's calm, methodical response only deepened the dread. "You thought you were untouchable, didn't you?" Simon's voice echoed through the phone, unbothered by Kelvin's father's sputtering denials. "You thought your wealth and your influence could shield you from the truth. But here we are, old man. Your empire's crumbling, and there's nothing you can do about it." Kelvin's father's face went pale, his hands shaking now. The sense of invulnerability he had always relied on was slipping through his fingers like sand. The bravado that once defined him now seemed hollow and meaningless. He stood there in stunned silence, staring at the officers around him, knowing they would be the ones to take him down. Simon continued to speak, his tone a mixture of satisfaction and finality. "You've been running your little empire for too long, hiding your sins behind money and power. But no more. The people you've hurt, the lives you've destroyed, they deserve justice. And now they'll get it." Kelvin's father opened his mouth to speak, to try and turn the tables, but nothing came out. The weight of his situation pressed down on him with such intensity that his mouth went dry. He was no longer the man who controlled everything, who held people's fates in his hands. Now he was a prisoner of his own making, trapped by his own actions. As the sound of police sirens grew louder, the door to the house was kicked open, and a team of heavily armed officers swarmed in, taking positions around the mansion. The light from the helicopters above cut through the night, casting long, eerie shadows across the rooms. "Get on the ground," one of the officers barked, his gun raised as he moved toward Kelvin's father. "Now." With no room for defiance, Kelvin's father sank to his knees, his face a picture of defeat. The grandiose thoughts of his power, his untouchability, all seemed so foolish now. He looked up at Simon's image on the phone screen, rage and helplessness mixing in his gaze. "You think you've won, don't you?" Kelvin's father sneered, the venom still evident in his voice despite the defeat. "You think this is over, Simon? You think you can do whatever you want to me and get away with it?" Simon's eyes glinted with quiet authority as he replied, "You were never untouchable. Not from the start." Kelvin's father tried to stand, his fists clenched, but the officers were already moving toward him. One of them grabbed him by the arm, pushing him face first to the ground. His body was roughly secured, his hands bound behind his back. Every struggle he made only deepened his humiliation. The police found Kelvin alongside his other accomplice in the basement of the house. They frowned at his methods, but the officer in charge understood why he did it and let him off with just a warning. You shouldn't take matters into your hands next time. Always report to the police for your own safety, the officer said, looking more concerned than angry. You will rot for this, Kelvin's father spat, barely able to contain his fury. You can't hide forever. You've just made yourself an even bigger target. But Simon didn't flinch. He didn't react to the threats. He had won. I don't need to hide, old man, Simon said calmly. The truth is out, and nothing you do can change that. Your empire's crumbled. All your connections, all your power. It's all useless now. You're nothing. Kelvin's father growled in frustration as the officers dragged him out of the house and toward the waiting police vehicles. As they shoved him into the back of one of the cars, he cast one final furious look at Simon, who stood outside watching, his expression unreadable. You think this is over? He shouted one last time, his voice hoarse with rage. You've made a terrible mistake, Simon. You'll never get away with this. Simon watched the car drive off into the night, his heart still cold, his resolve unshaken. He had done what he came to do. He had brought justice to his wife and children. And with that, Simon knew that his battle was finally over. As the helicopter faded into the distance, Simon let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The storm was over, the world would soon know the truth, and he could finally let the weight of vengeance lift from his shoulders.